Welcome to Interviews from Mexico. I'm Laura Carlson, and I'll be your host as we look at cutting-edge issues with the men and women who know them best, here on Telesur. Immigration turned out to be one of the top issues that the Republican Party used to mobilize their base in the past midterm elections in the United States, with more or less mixed results. With the Central American caravan, or exodus, coming up through Mexico toward the U.S. border, there's been a lot of focus on the issue and people going into or trying to go into the United States. But what about those who are coming back? The people, especially young people, who are either deported or forcibly returned to their home countries after living almost an entire lifetime in the United States. On today's program, we're very fortunate to have with us Jill Anderson. Jill, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you.
Jill is the co-director here in Mexico City of Otros Dreams en Acción, Other Dreams in Action, a group of young people who have been deported or returned from the United States and who have organized for their rights and for the difficult process of assimilating back into a society that some of them don't even really know. Jill, could you describe a little bit what your organization does here?
Sure. Yeah, we actually just recently in enero, I'm thinking in Spanglish, in January, we inaugurated a new cultural space here in Mexico City called Punja House, or Punja House. And pocho is a term that's used for traditionally, and it's a derogatory negative term for Mexicans who went to the States and have come back and are maybe being pretentious, or this is sort of the way it translates directly into rotten fruit. Are no longer Mexican or totally Mexican, right?
I never knew the origins of that word.
Yeah. So it's very painful for a lot of people who've experienced hearing that word at their family dinner table, and it's been painful for this generation of young people who are basically in exile from their home in the United States because they grew up there. Many of them speak English better than Spanish. Was their first kiss, right? So what we're doing is really organizing, but also creating a safe space, and that they're sort of laying out what this new culture and these new demands are, because it's so new. This is a whole new, they say they're not dreamers, but they're the sons and daughters of NAFTA. They've been, their identities in a sense have been created by these migration policies. And so ODA is really accompanying this population in their process that's ongoing here in Mexico and their demands to go back to the U.S., but also to be here in Mexico. De aquí, de allá, the right not to migrate and the right to go there, the right for mobility.
Well, yeah, it must be particularly painful, this term pocho, a derogatory term in Spanish for people who have lost their Mexican culture because they just got kicked out of the U.S. culture. So it's like, who loves me?
Right, and that sense of being ni de aquí ni de allá, I'm not from here or from there, is now completely written in policy and enforcement procedures, right? You really aren't from here or from there, and their experience in Mexico reinforces that.
They get the same kind of rejection here in Mexico?
Many, it's a very diverse population, and this is something that, I've been working with these issues and with this community for over 6 years now. So this was happening under Obama also, even before Trump. People either being deported or making the very difficult decision to return because a family member was deported, or because many who lived in states like Georgia and Alabama and Florida, where it was very hard to continue their education after high school or find a job, thought, why not go to Mexico? There I'm a citizen, there I have papers, I'll be able to go to school, I'll be able to find a job, and really based on what they'd heard from their parents or from family members, many times against the wishes of their parents, who were like, no, Mexico's not like here, it'll be hard. And then they got here, and it was actually, many of them found themselves to be undocumented in Mexico.
How's that?
In the sense that for example, when you arrive, the documents that you may have from the United States, like the matricula consular, is not valid.
Which would be the consulate document of identity.
Exactly,
Yeah.
that many Mexicans have been able to get from their consulate nearby, and then they get here and it's not recognized in the banks, it's not valid.
Why, if it's from a Mexican consulate?
Right? It's mind-boggling. It's mind-boggling. For them too. They're like, and it's shocking. And then to get, you know, to get a birth certificate, for those who are deported, they have no documents when they arrive, and then it can be quite many bureaucratic hurdles to get those documents. For example, the INE, which is the electoral card, which is the most common form of ID for, you know, renting a place, for opening a bank account, for getting money sent to you from your relatives in the U.S. To get that, many times, if it's expired or if it was, sometimes you can get an INE from the consulate now too. There's a new program. But if you go to renew or change your address, sometimes they'll ask for 2 or 3 witnesses here in Mexico. But if you've just been returned or deported, you don't have that kind of network even to bring witnesses. So to get that document has been extremely challenging. During the electoral season, they stopped giving out the documents for about 4 months. And all those people who were deported during that time had no way to have that, you know, identity document. So that's what we mean when we say people come back and they find themselves undocumented in their country of birth.
Well, I mean, these kinds of things are basically technological or rather bureaucratic fixes that should be relatively easy. What's going on there? Is there a lack of political will? Are they just completely inept in fixing these problems for what's obviously a growing population? About how many people are here? And there's about 3.6 million people who have returned or been deported. Those are estimates from... In what time period?
Around 2006 to 2015.
Oh my gosh, that's a lot.
And those are conservative estimates because no one's counting when people cross the border. No one's counting, you know, we have really the census data from 2010 and then hopefully census data from 2020 will give us much more accurate numbers because there's 1 or 2 questions that help us understand across the country people who have been out of the country for a long time and are now back. But there's no one other than we have the data of those who have been repatriated or removed, and we have some surveys from COLEF and other places that give us a sense of the numbers who are returning, but no one is counting this population. So I would say 3.6 million is actually conservative. And it's a lot,
and
huge. And that's based on, you know, those who the Obama administration deported, those who came back during the economic crisis in 2007, 2008, and those who continue to be returned or to return under the Trump policies.
To give us a sense of the kind of problems and the kind of personal stories that are involved here, tell us about someone you know and what they went through from a deportation in the United States to landing basically in Mexico.
I really have to think about whose story I'd like to share because at this point I know so many and the stories are so diverse. It's hard to really focus on one. Recently, you know, actually at Punja House now, 1 to 3 people who have experienced deportation stop by each week. Just by word of mouth or by internet, they find us. So one young man, he had a stay of removal for many years. So he had a deportation order that under Obama was a stay of removal, and he would go sign, you know, we've read about these stories in the news. He would go sign each month, or I think it was every 3 months, to say that he was still there and that he was in this process.
Where was he? What state?
He was in North Carolina. And what the Trump administration has done has basically pulled sort of a protection off of those people and made them basically they're available for deportation in ways that they were in a legal process, so it wasn't a total protected status, it was pretty much a memorandum, it was an enforcement
But still,
policy.
They're playing by the rules.
They're playing by the
rules.
rules.
Signing, and they're grabbed.
They're signing, and they are grabbed when they go to the courthouse to sign.
In the courthouse.
And so he goes to sign. One of his best friends is outside, and he says, "Can I tell her what's happening?" When the immigration agent, so he's signing with Homeland Security, UCSIS, and it's ICE that's and we're not even sure always that they're in communication, but ICE comes and picks him up right there. He says, can I talk to my best friend? Can I tell her what's happening? They're like, no. He was like, well, can you give her my phone and all? So he gives his phone and all of his wallet and everything to her because he was worried about it not getting it back. She takes it, and then he gets detained and sent immediately to a detention center. I forget which one now. And she actually calls a friend who was volunteering at Punja House. And he basically immediately, you know, we sort of went into action with what we know about how to track someone, about how to help them. We were able to, you know, let him know what kind of documents he would need.
So you do work over the border too?
Oh yeah, we have a network across Mexico and the United States. We actually have a network of 160 young people who are undocumented or formerly undocumented, who are in touch with each other and you know, working together on these issues on both sides, and really trying to reimagine what does it mean to do binational solidarity work, you know, in this new moment.
Essential.
Absolutely essential and so hard, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So anyway, so then we were able to follow him. A friend that he made in the detention center ended up helping him go to Tepic because they were dropped off in Reynosa, I think, and they were so nervous and rightfully so, and they were just like, we got to get out of here. They didn't even go by the Somos Mexicanos Repatriation Center because they just felt like, we just got to get a bus out of here. So they had some money from relatives sent to them through another friend because he didn't have any identity documents, went to Tepic, and then we were able to help him get on a bus to Mexico City. And then his friend flew down. This also is often, you know, U.S. family members and friends often become part of the support network in addition to Mexican family, if there is still a Mexican network. But if you've been in the U.S. for 10 or 20 years, many times your network in Mexico is very fragile. You know, it's people that maybe you talk to on Skype or maybe you text, but it's not sort of your solidarity network. So she came down and we were able to support him to get his, you know, it takes about 2 weeks to get a birth certificate, a CURP, and an INE. And we were able to help him find some housing for those 2 weeks with,
How old is he?
Partners. He is in his 20s, early 20s.
And he had been in the United States
since he was 14, 13. Yeah, so that's just one example of so many, hundreds, you know, in our network, and of course thousands in the context of what's happening on a daily level, you know, to families and young people because of these deportation policies.
Are you seeing any kinds of improvements as your group and other organizations have worked to raise the issues, especially with government authorities in these various offices?
Yeah, so we actually were, before our group was created, it's been a long process, and it was in part born out of a book that I did called Los Otros Dreamers. And through that book, we participated with a lot of other organizations and individuals working with the CEP, the Secretaría de Educación Pública, the Department of Education here in Mexico, to change the revalidation requirements. So, because I mentioned, so first you're undocumented and you have to find out where to live. Then you have to find out your livelihood, where to work. And then many people have been interested in continuing their education, particularly in this sort of generation. You know, they're bilingual or becoming even more bilingual after returning. They finished high school or got their GED in the United States. Many times they're the first family member to have graduated from high school. And they're interested in continuing their higher education, or they had partial high school and they want to continue high school, especially young kids who have arrived at 17, 16 years old, and it's been very challenging for them to insert themselves into the Mexican high school system. So we were really involved for several years in processing the Senate with the Department of Education to change those, and actually in February or April really of 2017 of last year, in part we call it the Trump effect, but in part because sort of many people sort of woke up to the fact that this was happening, even though it had been happening for years, when Trump made it, such a Twitter headline issue.
One beneficial
Right. I mean, in all
it.
irony, it's the Trump effect. And so many of the changes that we'd been advocating for several years were actually taken up and written into law and to the new regulations for revalidating your studies from outside. And this actually supports refugees and in addition to Mexican citizens, because it's anyone who has an education outside of the U.S. And now, at least on paper, it's easier, faster, there's more, more flexible to be able to revalidate your studies. And for the first time ever, the GED is recognized in Mexico. Before it wasn't even recognized as an equivalent to a high school degree.
GED, which is the general equivalency exam, which you can get as a high school degree without actually finishing the coursework.
You take about 3 months courses and you can finish.
Yeah, and take the exam. Well, that's very important as a gain. Of course, as in everything, it remains to be seen how well it works too in practice. But speaking of refugees, your group worked with the refugees, the Central American exodus or caravan coming through Mexico City. What was the work that they carried out there, and why the contact between the deported from the United States and those who are still following, and some of them even still say it this way, the American dream?
Right. That was really, in many ways, the reason why we felt like we needed to be there, because one, the Trump policies and the Trump reaction to the caravan and the exodus affects Mexican families and Mexican mixed status. Mixed status means there's, some who might have U.S. citizenship, some who might have DACA, some who might have a green card, and some who are deported, who are now on the other side of the border. And it directly affects them. So we feel like their cause is our cause. We also
And it directly affects them how?
In the sense that the criminalization of any unlawful presence and crossing along the border, that affects all Central Americans, and no matter your nationality, the higher level of danger that people are facing certainly affects them.
And it whipped up a lot of racism.
Continually whipping up a lot of racism, exactly, and in general, twisting the reality of migration to such an extent that it becomes about, really about us versus them, about, and about this racist other that's invading our country. And when many of the people in our network are from the United States and from Mexico, and they grew up, they're like, best friends with maybe a white or an Asian American kid, or even a Mexican American kid who has citizenship. And there's nothing different. There's nothing that divides them except for now these racist policies and this very twisted understanding of our region and our countries. So I think, that definitely
and as you say, of what immigration is and what it means. Right,
and one of the things, and we have these conversations all the time in our network and at Punja House, because even amongst, everyone's working out their relationship to these discourses about being illegal or being not illegal, and can a person can never be illegal, but then again, I've come back to Mexico to finally be in my country of birth, but it turns out that I don't have all of those rights and facilities I thought I would. So there's this deep questioning about what does it mean to be a citizen, but an identity, but also what does it mean to be a citizen really, and what does it mean to be from a nation and to be patriotic, and really is that allowing me to do the things that I need to do and want to do with my family and my life and my future and my community. And so I mean we're in those debates all the time, and in ways that are much more interesting than you read about in the Trump version of this reality that's so distorted.
So what would Other Dreams in Action member say to a Honduran refugee who's trying to get into the United States? What are they saying to this caravan?
Well, what we said and what I overheard many of them sharing was, first of all, there is the struggle against this system that makes us have to leave, that forced our parents, in the case of those who are dreamers or identify as dreamers, to leave, and that now deports and detains us. this, you know, that struggle is here in Mexico too, and that struggle is in Central America, and that struggle is in the U.S. It's not just in the U.S. And that's something that we're saying all the time everywhere, but that's something that they've said very clearly. You know, this, because many, the caravan and the exodus it's going north, you know, it wants to be in the United States. Like you said, many even have this idea of the American dream, even though, you know, it's complicated, but it's certainly better than Honduras, you know, and also there's a sense that Mexico is not any safer, which is understandable. Mexico, there are parts of Mexico that are equally unsafe and violent to San Pedro Sula in Honduras, right? So we've sort of just had conversations about those realities, and that Mexico is actually a lot bigger of a country, that there are places where you can be a part of this struggle. It's not easy. There's racism in Mexico also. But really inviting them to sort of join this struggle in Mexico and in the U.S., always respecting their decision. Because I think that part of the amazing sort of model, even though it's so complicated and difficult to understand, of the exodus, is the fact that when you're fighting for your life, when you can't feed your kids, when climate change has made it hard to get a crop for 3 to 4 years now, migration is freedom, migration is life, and that's what they're saying. And that's partly what's being so distorted, because that is the reality. That's what we've heard over and over and over, accompany, you know, just being here in Mexico City and listening to them. And we understand that, you know, we get that. And many of the young people who've been deported and detained can hear that. But we're really clear that there's options in Mexico, maybe that weren't there, and hopeful that maybe with the new government and the new transition government in Mexico City, you know, that some of these really nice laws, this respect for human rights, will extend to not only deportees and returnees, but also refugees and asylum seekers in new ways. And we want to be a part of that. And we talked about ways that they might be a part of that. But it's also, what can you offer, really? You know, it's it's going to be hard here too. It's the worst of many difficult possibilities. It's really difficult.
Yeah, between a rock and a hard place, to say the least.
Exactly.
But the phrase "migration is life" is very powerful, and you do see that so much. I've got to keep moving forward, because this is how I survive.
Exactly.
And this is how this is the only way I can create new horizons. Do you talk to them specifically about the kinds of things they can expect now in the United States?
Yeah, so we went there with the idea of sharing the realities in Mexico City. So sort of saying, this is what it says on the poster, this is the reality. You know, these are the rights, but this is what the day-to-day. And then that also true of Mexico, and also true of the northern border and the United States. And even once you got into the United States, if you get in, these are the realities. So we talked about including, you know, the lines in Tijuana, the fact that, you know, it's very difficult to apply for asylum. 2 of the members of our community went and shared their experience of being rejected for asylum and being deported days later, and the trauma of that experience for them and their families. And the idea is that they go more informed, not to persuade anyone. And also, you know, and then we also always referred people to lawyers. Obviously, we weren't lawyers. We weren't doing any sort of asylum, you know, counseling
in the legal sense.
In a legal sense. But sharing the realities, which is so important, because the asylum system actually rejects many people who are fleeing for their lives because the qualifications internationally, really, not just the U.S. You know, in Europe
we're talking
also.
about a global phenomenon.
Right.
And the Mexican asylum system.
The Mexican asylum system also, where
it just keeps you on hold for like basically a very long time.
Right.
Yeah. So what were some of the responses? Did you find that there was an empathy between the people who have left their countries and are seeking to go to the United States, in how your group was received and listened to?
Not only an empathy, but many of the people had been in the United States and deported from the United States before, you know, so they'd already been deported back to Honduras or Guatemala, and then facing those increased challenges in the same sort of scenario here in Mexico, but in that you know, even more difficult context, had made the decision to join the caravan. And so they're, you know, oh, how many months were you in detention? Oh, I was there 6 months. I was there 4 months. Which center? You know, those were the conversations. And one of the things that's clear, we talk about this a lot with counterparts in the U.S. who think a lot about Latinos and Latinas, right? And we've been talking about how in this new reality, the Latinos, there's like the second diaspora of Latinos and Latinas. And so a young person who grew up in their high school or went to college in, you know, California is deported or returns to Mexico and identifies as much as a Latino or Latina as she may as Mexican, right? Yeah. Which is, I mean, that's really a US produced sort of identity because of the immigration dynamic for the last 30 years. And now they're here, and now with the Exodus Caravan, you're seeing that sort of, you know, that Latin sort of kind of empathy, but shared experience that's constructed by a U.S. racist sort of mechanism of deporting people, expelling them, but also drawing them for labor, and you know, and around the last 30 years, it's relatively new. It's my lifetime that this phenomenon has sort of been created.
And it's changing all the time.
Right.
I'm really struck by this question of labels, because you have people, are you a deported person? Are you returned? You know, we have the system itself to kind of process people has this necessity or this obsession with putting labels on people, and yet you see, because of the flows, because of the complexity, even in nationality, which is something we consider part just kind of bedrock of our identity, is so much in flux that you have this complete confusion of labels that both on the personal and political level gets to be very complicated, but also kind of opens up new opportunities.
Exactly.
And on that note, unfortunately, we have to end the show because very quickly we've come to the end of our time. You know, but I want to thank you so much for being here with us, Jill.
Thank you very much.
And thank you for watching. We'll be back next week on Interviews from Mexico.